How's it going, everyone? As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne and this is Deck Ready, my channel all about the Steam Deck. For those of you who regularly watch the channel, I have a spider update for you. A couple weeks ago, a spider came down while I was recording and I let him go on the floor. He immediately disappeared, but I know he's still around here because my camera is covered in a giant spider web. So he's chilling. He's probably in the battery port or something. So if my camera stops working, we all know who the culprit is. In today's video, I have 3 topics to cover. The first one is that there's a new way to double your Steam Deck's FPS, and it actually works pretty good. The second news story is that Valve just introduced a game-changing feature that'll allow you to find games that are running well on the Steam Deck even easier. And third, I'm going to tell you about the latest game on deck that you need to pick up immediately. All right, let's jump into the first news story here, which is how to double the FPS on your Steam Deck. And I'm going to throw out a caveat really quick just at the beginning that this only works if you're running Windows on your Steam Deck. But I noticed in the comments in the last few videos when we were talking about the Windows drivers becoming available for the Steam Deck OLED that a lot of people at the very least have Windows installed on a micro SD card on their Steam Deck. So I think this is something worth knowing about. So there's a new-ish form of scaling that's not DLSS or FSR or XESS or any of the other upscalers out there called lossless scaling. And this one is basically built to make it so that if you're running a game at a lower resolution, it'll scale the game up in a really good way to where it'll match the game to your monitor's resolution exactly, and you get good performance out of it. So you could do this on the ROG Ally, the ROG Ally X, or the Legion Go, and a lot of people are reporting that they have, and they've seen minor bumps, but ETA Prime, one of my favorite YouTubers, just tried it out with a Windows install on the Steam Deck, and in 3 separate games, he was able to basically double the performance of the games without losing a whole lot of image quality. Lossless scaling also introduces frame generation, which, you know, I go back and forth on frame generation. I think it's cool, right? Like if you have a PC that can reliably run games at like 120 FPS, frame generation is definitely worth using because it's just gonna only introduce frames once in a while. Like once in a blue moon, when you drop a frame, you'll have an AI frame inserted there and you won't have a lot of latency or anything like that. And it'll be so infrequent that you actually see one of those AI generated frames that you arguably won't even notice it. But if you have a PC that can only run games at a lock 60, I don't think frame generation is worth using, especially if you want to use VSync, because it will introduce so much latency with your controls that I'd argue it's definitely not worth it. And when you work your way down to the Steam Deck where the base output is 30 FPS and then you're using frame generation to double it to 60, it's definitely not worth it because you're going to be seeing those AI generated frames constantly and you're going to get a lot of artifacting, you're going to get a lot of rough edges, you're going to see some wonkiness in crosshairs in games to the point where it's, again, just not worth using on the device. But in this case, with the lossless scaling using frame generation, it honestly doesn't look as bad as it does when you use frame generation with FSR 3 on the Steam Deck, to my eye at least. And this could be the first one that I think is worth trying out, especially of course, if you have a Windows install on your Steam Deck or Steam Deck OLED. So the first game he tested was Cyberpunk 2077 at low settings. Without lossless scaling turned on, it was running at around 50 FPS, which honestly is pretty good. Like if you can get it locked at 40 FPS, I think that would be the way to go because then you're not introducing AI generated frames. But when he turned on lossless scaling, it jumped up to over 80 FPS, which honestly would be pretty cool to have a handheld version of Cyberpunk running at 80 FPS. I know it's not a true 80 FPS, but again, after seeing it in motion, the artifacting and wonkiness doesn't seem to be nearly as bad as it is in games like Spider-Man Remastered when you're using FSR 3 frame generation. So if you're running Windows, you might want to try it out with Cyberpunk because that seems pretty cool. The second game he tried was Hogwarts Legacy. With the software off, it was running at an average of 34 FPS. Now, this is a game that I have tried to get running at a locked 30 on the Steam Deck with, you know, acceptable visuals before, and I have never gotten it to stay at 30 FPS. Like, not even considering the like stutter that happens when you traverse different doorways and stuff like that. There's a lot of points in that map that you have to run all over where you'll just regularly see it drop into the low 20s. And to me, with how low the settings are in that game is just not acceptable. But when he used lossless scaling, it again doubled the frame rate and got it up to around 60 FPS. FPS. Now that's one I still wouldn't do because you basically have to still run it at the lowest setting, so it's not going to look good on its own. And when you're introducing the AI generated frames, even with the reduced wonkiness that you get from FSR 3 with lossless scaling, I still think it's not worth it. I know I'm in the minority there because if you check that list of the top 10 games played on Steam Deck, Hogwarts Legacy is always in at least, the top 10, maybe it drops to the 20, but people love to play that game on the Steam Deck for some reason. So I'm definitely in the minority there. So if you have a Windows install, it would definitely be worth using this lossless scaling over just trying to run it at 30 FPS, because at least in my experience, you're never going to get a hard lock 30 out of this game to begin with. And then the last game he tested was Elden Ring. This is another double FPS increase. It was running at around 33 FPS on low on the Steam Deck with Windows, which honestly, the settings don't seem to matter for that game. I just did an Elden Ring playthrough in June, and I was running it at mostly medium and high settings. And I got to be honest, I had the frame time graph up pretty much the entire time. And there were a couple moments, like literally 2 in my 100-hour play session, that, it would stutter a little bit. Like you'd get a 1-frame spike when you were traversing between one area to the other. But it does that anyway on my 4090 PC in pretty much the same areas. So that seems like a problem with the game and not the Steam Deck itself. So 33 seems kind of low for the Windows install. So I would stick to the SteamOS side of things for Elden Ring, especially knowing that it gets rid of a lot more of the random stutters you see on Windows. But if you use lossless scaling with that game, again, you get a double FPS increase to around 60 FPS, which is pretty cool because that's a game where it really matters. I'm really curious though if frame generation would screw up your attack timing in Elden Ring, right? I think it would be honestly better to have a more consistent actual 30 FPS than a 60 FPS with AI generated frames, because timing matters so much in that game. With 3 of the biggest and hardest to run games on the Steam Deck, this seems like a cool thing that actually works right. And if more people start downloading Windows, especially knowing that the drivers are out at this point to actually be able to do that on the Steam Deck OLED, this could definitely be something I see Valve sort of like re-engineering for Linux and then working it into SteamOS itself. In the quick access menu, you have FSR built in, you've got the different scaling that you can do. I even added an NVIDIA one, which is kind of crazy considering that it uses an AMD chip. I wouldn't use any of them in most cases over the scaling that ships with most games, because I think it's like FSR 1.0 still built into the Steam Deck, and I wish they'd update it, but they don't really seem to want to. Even with all of that in mind though, FSR still just isn't as good as DLSS. Like I have an NVIDIA PC with the 4090, and when I use DLSS, even on performance on DLSS 3, even without frame generation, to my eye at least, looks better in 99% of the cases that I've used it than quality mode or ultra quality mode does with FSR 3.0. There's just something weird about the way that FSR 3.0 handles edges and hair that makes it immediately noticeable that you're using the scaling, whereas with NVIDIA's version, DLSS, in most cases when you're using DLSS, it looks better than using regular old anti-aliasing with, the native resolution and no upscaling being used at all. Like it really is that good. So hopefully as time goes on, AMD can figure that out, because even with lossless scaling, it doesn't work on SteamOS. So the best option at the end of the day is FSR 3.0. But it's still cool to know that you have these alternatives and cool things you can do over on the Windows side if you do decide to install it on your Steam Deck. I'm pretty sure this app is only $8. It came out, I think, around 2018, and I heard about it then, but there's something new that I got that makes it work a lot better. So honestly, if you've got a gaming PC or a gaming laptop that's a few years behind and you're already getting 80 to 90 frames out of games and you want to lock them at around that, but you're sick of seeing those little micro stutter frame drops, it might be worth picking this app up for your main PC and running it instead of using DLSS or FSR or XeSS, because you won't see those AI generated frames all that much. And that's really the best experience you can get when you're using frame generation. I know it's a matter of opinion. I know some people don't care about the wonkiness and they don't care about the weird artifacting you get around reticles in certain games like Starfield. I just personally do. I want the clearest image at the most consistent frame rate. And for me personally, on the Steam Deck at least, the best way to get that is by locking games at around medium to high settings at 30 FPS so that you get a perfectly flat frame time graph. That is music to my ears, diamonds to my eyes. I don't know what it is about it, but I can just handle a rock solid 30 FPS a lot better than I can a 40 FPS that drops into the high 30s or a 60 FPS that can drop all the way down into the high 40s. But that brings us to the second news story here, which is that Valve just released a really cool update for the Steam client that's going to make it a lot easier to find games that are playable on the Steam Deck. I know you guys are familiar with Steam's review system where you can go to any game on Steam and you can see not only how many people have reviewed it, which is always a good sign to see if a lot of people have picked up a game or not, because, you know, popularity isn't the best metric, but if you only have a little bit of money to spend at any given time and you want to jump into a quality game, if a lot of people have bought something on PC, that's generally a sign that the game at the baseline runs pretty well. And then it also assigns it like a quality rating. I don't know what to call it, like a positive or negative rating. So it starts at overwhelmingly positive, then you've got mostly positive, then mixed, then negative, then mostly negative, and overwhelmingly negative. And now they've added in an extra layer where you can see the device that people spent most of their time playing these games on. So I went and checked it out with Seleco, I don't really know how to say it, because I knew that a lot of people were playing the early access release of that game on the Steam Deck. And if you hover over a couple of the reviews, you'll see that if they have like 40 or 60 hours in the game, a little pop-up window will show up that says, hey, the vast majority of these hours that this person put into the game were done on the Steam Deck. And I think that's pretty cool because, you know, there is the verified system on the Steam Deck where if a game, you know, meets their arbitrary rules of not being too hard to read, booting without a launcher, or not needing an extra service or something like that to run, it'll get a verified rating. But that has come back to bite Valve many times in the past. The biggest outlier in terms of that is definitely The Last of Us Part 1 Remastered, or Last of Us Part 1 Remake, whatever they called it. When that came out, that port was a complete mess. And on my 4090 PC, there was no way I could get a 60 FPS experience out of it, even using upscalers. So when you try to run it on the hardware of the Steam Deck, it was impossible to even get a rock solid 30 FPS. I did get a lot of patches that mostly fixed it on my desktop PC, but I heard and did a video on it, I think like a year ago, that it was finally in a playable state on the Steam Deck, only to quickly realize that if you want a rock solid 30 FPS out of that game, not only do you have to basically run it at the lowest settings, but you have to set FSR3 to performance mode, and it just looks terrible. With a game like that, I think the main place you should play it is your PS5 on a big TV or on your main gaming PC with a graphics card that can lock it at 60 FPS, of course, with a nice monitor, because it is such a cinematic game. I don't think the verification system is all that great. So knowing that you can now look and see if people have played countless hours of a game on the Steam Deck, I think that's a much better quality metric than the verification system, because, you know, PC gamers are used to good performance. And if they're willing to sink hundreds of hours into a game on a handheld device that's underpowered compared to what they have with their main gaming PC, chances are the game looks and runs pretty dang good on the Steam Deck, which is great overall. I understand why they don't want to do this. Of course, they don't want to put a system in place that verifies if a game runs at like 30 FPS or 40 or 60 FPS at medium or high settings or low settings, because if they do that and a game doesn't run all that well, they might lose out on a sale from someone who doesn't really care about performance and is going to play the game regardless. I just talked about Hogwarts Legacy in the last story about how that game doesn't run well at all on the Steam Deck, but it's consistently at least in the top 20 purchased games that are played on the Steam Deck, and those are the most played games, so the most hours logged for a game on the Steam Deck. So clearly there is a pretty sizable group of Steam Deck owners out there who don't care so much about consistent performance and are willing to put up with lower graphics and like fluctuating FPS, so they don't want to eliminate those people and scare them off from buying and trying games in the first place by having a metric. But I think that that small group of people who are like that is worth sacrificing for the overall quality of experience badge, because I don't like the system of a game coming out that seems like it would be something that I want to play on the Steam Deck and then having to wait at least 12 or 13 hours for all these other channels out there like Steam Deck Gaming who do performance videos and tell you the best settings to run at. A, because I want to play a game when I have time and I usually play games in the morning, and B, everyone has a different idea of of what the best settings are. I know Steam Deck Gaming always goes for the best middle ground between performance, quality, and battery life, which results in lower settings than I would like and a higher baseline FPS than I really care about. And at the end of the day, I couldn't care less about battery life, because even if I'm out of the house and I'm playing at a coffee shop or something like that, chances are I have my battery bank on me at that given time, and that thing can charge my Steam Deck 2 or 3 times over. So even if I run out of battery, it's not a big deal. And there are other people out there like Santiago, I think is his name. He does really cool breakdowns of profiles for games like low, medium, high, checks all the different resolutions. That's pretty much my favorite source for seeing how a game runs. But I just like, the Steam Deck is such a closer thing to a console than a PC at this point, that I want it to get closer to the point of a console, which is that at the very least with a console, you know that it's going to run at lower settings than your PC in most cases, but it'll be much closer to a consistent experience out of the box than what you're used to. Anyway, that brings us to the third news story, which is a game recommendation. I know no one watches these, but there are a few of you out there who actually buy these games when I recommend them. I don't get a kickback or anything. I'm just recommending you games I like. And today I'm bringing you a collection of 3 of my favorite games of all time. It's the Castlevania Dominus Collection, which was just shadow dropped after the Nintendo Direct. So this is retailing for $24.99, and in it you get 3 of my favorite Castlevania games ever. The first one being Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow. This was actually my introduction to Castlevania. When the 3DS came out, my friends and I all got them with our grad money that we got from our high school graduation parties, and all of us went to GameStop and bought Dawn of Sorrow for some reason, even though it was an original DS game, and we spent weeks that summer just grinding through one of the best Metroidvanias ever made. It takes place in the future. I think it's like 2100 or something like that. You play as the character from Aria of Sorrow, which is another one of my favorite Castlevania games that I ended up playing when they released the GBA collection. It has guns. You can steal powers from the enemies. You become an overpowered badass. It's very similar to Symphony of the Night if you've ever played that one. You should buy this collection just to play Dawn of Sorrow, because it's better than most games. Like even indie games like Blasphemous 2 or The Last Faith, all of those are chasing the high that I got playing Dawn of Sorrow for the first time. I put in a couple of hours before I started recording today, and it runs and plays phenomenally. Another cool thing they did, because these are DS games, is it runs a lot like Emudex Melon DS sort of flavor, where you have the top screen on the left side, but the cool thing it does is it takes the 2 menus that you had access to from the bottom screen and puts both bottom screen menus on the right side of the screen. So not only can you see Soma Cruz's character stats at all time, but you can also see the map. I think that's awesome. And they also, shockingly for Konami, went the extra mile and made it so while yes, you can use the touch screen to do the magic scroll symbols, it actually added in button inputs, which make them a whole lot easier if you don't have a touch screen on your device. So if you're playing this on a PS5 or a gaming PC, you can rest assured that you're going to be able to play this game without a touch screen, because they went in and fixed it, which is great because you don't expect Konami to do stuff like that. The second game you get is Castlevania Portrait of Ruin. This one also calls back to Symphony of the Night. It's kind of like the prototype, I would say, for what you get out of Dawn of Sorrow, and I think this is an underrated Castlevania game. I think the main character is cool. You're also pretty overpowered by the end game, and the map is awesome. This one is a lot more vampire and like gothic horror flavored than what you get out of Dawn of Sorrow as well, because that one's more futuristic horror. Again, I think it's underrated, and I like it more than 2 out of 3 of the GBA games, excluding Aria of Sorrow, of course, because that's my second favorite Castlevania ever, but it's much better than the other 2 you get in that collection, and it's definitely worth playing. And then the third one you get is Order of Ecclesia, and this one, it tries to add some new things, like you have 2 playable characters that can kind of like team up and do dual attacks and everything like that. Just there's some stuff that doesn't work right for me in it. I don't really care about the 2 character thing. I thought that was kind of cool at the time, but it really becomes more of a frustration than a feature as the game goes on. So I kind of fell off of it pretty quickly, and I just don't really like the map, if I'm being honest. So yeah, out of the 3 that you get with this collection, that would be the one. If you're only going to play 2 of these games, that'd be the one I'd skip. And then they also added in Haunted Castle, which is like the prototype version of Castlevania, I guess, from Japan. It's like an arcade game that I have never even heard of, which is shocking because Castlevania is one of my favorite franchises. So it's a nice little bonus, not something that I really care too much to dig into. So half the collection is like 2 of the best Castlevania games I've ever played. Portrait of Ruin is underrated, and Dawn of Sorrow, in my opinion, is probably the best 2D Castlevania. I know that's blasphemous to people who grew up with Symphony of the Night, but like, I don't know. There's just something about Dawn of Sorrow that just takes everything from all the Castlevania games I like and mashes it together into something even better than the parts that it uses to make its whole. Whereas Symphony of the Night is just a really great classic game that holds up to this day. There's just something extra special about Dawn of Sorrow that makes me like it more than Symphony of the Night. And Portrait of Ruin, like I said, is underrated. I think everyone should try that game out. And if you enjoy the first opening act, it just gets better from there. But yeah, the other two, I don't know. I've never played Haunted Castle, obviously, and I didn't really love Order of Ecclesia. But still, for 25 bucks, we're getting into the Halloween season. These games are both long enough to carry you throughout October and September. And as far as I'm concerned, they're two of the best games that have ever come out on the Nintendo DS. And it's awesome that you can just access them on the Steam Deck. I got nervous for a sec when I saw it during the Nintendo Direct, and they were like, it's available later today on Nintendo Switch. I was like, what? They put out the GBA collection immediately on Steam. Why aren't they doing that for this one? But then I checked Steam like 20 minutes after the Direct and it was up available for purchase. So I grabbed it immediately, tried it out, and it looks and runs amazing. And because these are Nintendo DS games, you're going to get hours and hours of battery life out of them. Definitely go check them out. Look at Green Man Gaming if you want to save some money. But yeah, I think this collection is well worth the $25. And if you're one of those people who plays games on Nintendo Switch and waits for the physical release from limited run games, if you're playing on Steam Deck, you can't do that. I don't even think they make PC physical versions. So don't wait, play this game while it's available right now. Anyway, guys, that's all I've got for you in today's video. As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching and shape on.